מדעיים שקשה יותר להנגיש מאשר נושאים אחרים. ברור שתרופה לסרטן רלוונטית יותר לקוראי העיתונים מאשר איזה קוורק עלום שם. ואכן, פיזיקאים ובעיקר מתמטיקאים משתמשים בתירוץ הזה השכם והערב להסביר למה את מה שהם עושים פשוט אי אפשר להנגיש לקהל הרחב. האורח שלנו היום הדגים פעם אחר פעם שזה לא בהכרח נכון. סיימון סינג, דוקטור לפיזיקה ויוצר תוכניות מדע ב-BBC, הוא מחברם של המשפט האחרון של פרמה, שהפך חידה מתמטית לרב מחר עולמי מפתיע, סודות ההצפנה, המפץ הגדול, ריפוי או פיתוי, והסודות המתמטיים של הסימפסונים. וכדי שנוכל לשוחח, אעבור עכשיו לאנגלית. Shalom and welcome to Simon Singh, an author, journalist, and TV producer specializing in science and mathematics, who will help us understand how to transform research into a story. With a PhD in particle physics from Cambridge University, Simon joined the BBC's science department. There he directed Fermat's last theorem that he also later published as a book, which was the first book about mathematics to become a #1 bestseller in the UK. It was then followed by many other successful mathematically themed popular books. Simon, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
So are the mathematicians and theoretical physicists right? Is it futile to try to communicate such topics to a general public and they should all stay at their offices and talk to their coffee machines?
Yeah, I think that's not a bad thing. I think scientists, their job is to do science. And I think for 95% of scientists, I think it's great if that's what they do. It's what they're good at, it's what they love. Scientists should do science. But if you're a scientist who enjoys communicating, and if you can do it well, that's really important. You've got to enjoy it and you've got to do it well. Then I think there are loads of opportunities to go out and talk about your work and to talk about your field. But I think the problem is that certainly here in the UK, there's almost an expectation that every scientist must go out and spread the word, whereas that's just silly. Scientists should get on and do their work and do it the best they can. And if, as I say, if they're good at it and if they can enjoy it, then they should go out and spread the word and explain and discuss and engage people about science. So I don't think it should be compulsory, is what I'm saying. It should be something that a small minority of scientists do, and they do it really well. And they do it effectively. So when a scientist says, I'm going to spend a day away from my lab doing science communication, how many people are they reaching? Which audiences are they reaching? What is the impact of their work going to be? What's the cost of that work going to be? So I think it's also about being very, very cost effective.
But what about mathematics? Is it really much harder than other sciences?
Yeah, I mean, some sciences are easier than others because, people are fascinated by dinosaurs. People are fascinated by volcanoes. People are fascinated by astronomy and cosmology. There are all sorts of things that are easier to communicate than, the science of friction is not particularly fascinating. Some elements of chemistry might be boring, whereas other elements of chemistry might be fascinating. So again, I think when scientists go out to communicate, you pick the things that are going to be interesting. Mathematics, for example, is more abstract, or some aspects of mathematics are more abstract. There are not so many pictures with mathematics, but some areas such as chaos theory and geometry are full of beautiful pictures and beautiful ideas. So I'm lucky. When I write my books, I only pick topics that I know will be interesting. So I pick topics where I find fascinating, and I hope my readers will also find it fascinating.
So the preface to the Hebrew edition of Fermat's last theorem is titled something like, "Mathematicians are human beings, but they hide it very well." It seems that your way of telling mathematical stories is to focus on the humanity of the people who do the mathematics, their passions and their errors.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think I do a couple of things. One is I take a long history to these ideas. So often going back to the ancient Greeks. And so you start off with simple ideas and you build them up over the centuries. And if you take this historical approach, then also you have lots of great stories to tell. But also, I try and focus on the scientists and the mathematicians as much as the science and the mathematics. Who are these people? What motivates them? What were their trials and tribulations? What were their successes? What were their failures? Who are the heroes and who are the villains? And before writing, as you mentioned in the introduction, I worked in television. And in television, you have to have drama, you have to have cliffhangers, you have to have a narrative, you have to have a good structure. So all of those things I brought into writing books. So the scientists are just as fascinating as the science, but what you mustn't do is forget the science and just write about the scientists and just tell nice stories. You have to explain the science. The science is, for me, certainly the science is what the books are really about.
But what do you do when there is no drama? When just, regular researchers
You don't write the book, you find a different topic.
Okay.
I mean, that's easy for me to say because, I can pick whatever topic I want. But, there are some areas of computer science that are fascinating. There are some areas that are kind of boring. So you just have to pick those stories that will have some appeal. Medical research is kind of inherently interesting because we're all interested in our health and health in general, particularly right now. So some areas are inherently easier to talk to the public about, and we just focus on those.
How do you write about math for people who do not read or even are intimidated by the language of mathematics?
I don't. That's, I hate poetry. You can write any book about poetry. I'm never going to read it. There's no point. I'm not that interested in music. So you can write as many books about music. I'm never going to read them. So I only write books for people who are curious about science. They don't need to know very much, but if they're curious, then great, I can meet them halfway. But people don't have to read books about maths. It's not compulsory. There are so many things in the universe to understand that other people can read other books. And I'll write books for people who are interested in maths or just curious about it.
But that's not completely true, because part of what made your books so successful is that you were able to get to newer audiences that didn't consider themselves as people who like math. I'm thinking about myself. I do not consider myself a person that likes math, and I really enjoyed as a teenager to read the book, in your books and later on.
What did you study at university?
Biology.
Biology. So as a biologist, you sit next to the mathematician and you say, oh, he's a mathematician, I'm terrible at maths.
Mm-hmm.
But what you forget is the biologist, compared to the rest of society, has spent their life studying categorization and process and logic and the whole basis of science. So you are very, very close to maths compared to everybody else that's out there. So the readers of Fermat's last theorem, some of them were mathematicians, some of them were scientists, some were people who kind of liked science. A lot of them were people who were just curious about the world and said, oh, okay, I'm kind of interested in science. I don't know much about it. I'm interested in maths. I don't know much about it, but I want to know more. And that's great. But if people are just disinterested, then that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. Let's say my book sold, say maybe around the world. Let's take a guess. Let's say my book sold 10 million copies around the world. Mm-hmm. Out of 5 billion people, it's less than 1 in 1,000, isn't it? Something like that. So, most people have never heard of my book. Most people have never read my book. They never will read my book. So I kind of still think that, there's only so many people you can reach out to.
Okay, so that is very a humble and non-evangelist way of thinking about science communication. In many ways, I'm feeling that there's this imperative of you should communicate and we should reach everyone, but it seems that that's definitely not what you think.
No, it's just, I hope that many schools in the UK have my books. I really hope they do. And if there's a kid who is curious about maths and they've kind of doing really well in their exams and they're kind of keen and they're interested, that they'll go and pick up my book and say, okay, let me read this book. Or a teacher will say, you know what, you really like math, don't you? Go and read this book. It's difficult, but I think you'll find it interesting. So my book is aimed at people who are interested or curious or are possibly on their way to being interested in math or science. Now, the book about the Simpsons, the mathematical secrets of the Simpsons, does go further, because that's a book that is about the world's most popular TV show. And part of the reason I wrote that book is that there are some people who are a bit scared of maths, but they're not scared of the Simpsons. And they immediately think, oh, right, I love the Simpsons. Hey, this is maybe a way I could learn about maths at the same time. It's clearly less terrifying. It's clearly more lighthearted. It's a different style of book. The chapters are much shorter. The maths is still quite difficult. There's lots of complicated ideas. But the way it's presented is more popular in that respect. You know, we did shows in London, something called Theatre of Science, with a friend of mine called Richard Wiseman. And, you know, he's a great speaker. His background is in magic. He's a psychologist now, but his background is in magic and performance. And I used to see him lecturing, and I thought it was funny and it was interesting. And I would say, look, you know, you should take this out of a lecture theatre and put it in a real theatre. You know, you do 45 minutes, I'll do 45 minutes. We'll stick it together. We'll call it a theatre show. And in that situation, I could talk a bit about maths. I could talk a bit about cryptography. I could talk a bit about cosmology. He would talk a little bit about deception, a little bit about illusion, a little bit about all sorts of different things. And it was in a theatre. So quite clearly, people say, well, if it's in a theatre, it must be entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
And so people, I think we attracted a new audience. And also, people tend to go to the theatre in groups or in pairs. So I could imagine saying to somebody, oh, look, you know, I'm going to the theatre tonight to see this thing. Why don't you come along? So people would bring along somebody who's maybe less interested in science, but thought, yeah, what the heck, I'll give it a go. Mm-hmm. So, you know, science communication has so many different aspects to it, and so many different audiences, and so many different approaches and you know, we don't have to reach everybody with every aspect of science engagement. So you know, my favorite example of science engagement is a YouTube channel called Numberphile, which is full of videos about mathematics. Mm-hmm. And you know, if you don't like mathematics, you won't watch this channel. It's really just, here's a math problem, here's another math problem, here's a weird number, here's a weird sequence, here's an odd discovery, here's a pattern that doesn't make sense. It's full of these beautiful 10-minute videos. And they've had 500 million downloads. 500 million. And I think they've done a huge service in terms of, I think most importantly, reaching out to kids who are interested in maths. And maybe they've done everything at school and they've understood all the kind of basic curriculum and they're learning for their exams and so on. But it's added a huge amount of adventure to their mathematical lives with 500 million videos being watched. That's just amazing. That's just mind-blowing. And people talk about books, and you know, authors are, you know, kind of sometimes treated as if they're quite important. But as I said before, you know, 10 million people read my book, and that's nothing compared to 500 million. So there are so many different ways of reaching people. And even though that's 500 million downloads, even though that's 500 million views, I would say 90% of those are related to people who are already curious and interested in maths.
Wow, you gave me a lot to think about. So I will thank you now. So thank you to Dr. Simon Singh and for joining us today and give us a really fresh and humble way of looking at science communication. We will meet again to discuss using research to influence policymaking and regulation towards the end of the course. Thank you.